Welcome to Libeth. Translation is always a negotiation, and the negotiation is always unequal. The receiving culture sets the terms. It determines what can be understood and what will remain opaque, what will seem familiar enough to accept, and what will be rejected as incomprehensible, what needs to be domesticated to become legible, and what can be allowed to remain strange. Mitford understood this better than most translators of his period, which is why his notes and introductions frequently pause to acknowledge the inadequacy of the English equivalents he is forced to use, the concepts that have no direct translation, the ways in which the Japanese ethical vocabulary does not map cleanly onto Victorian English moral language. But acknowledging the inadequacy of translation and overcoming it are different things, and no amount of acknowledgement changes the fundamental dynamic. The book was written for a British audience, published by a British publisher, received by British readers, and all of those facts shaped what it contained and how it was organized at levels that went far deeper than the individual translator's choices about specific words. The mechanical problem of translation is visible in the key ethical concepts that structure the tales. The Japanese word giri carries a meaning that English renders approximately as duty or obligation, but the approximation is imprecise in ways that matter. Duty in the Victorian English sense is typically framed as an obligation that a self acknowledges and chooses to fulfill. It is imposed from outside, but accepted from inside, and the moral weight of the concept depends on the individual's recognition of it as binding. Giri is something different. It is a web of relational obligation so thoroughly woven into the fabric of social existence that it does not require individual acknowledgement or choice to be operative. You owe what you owe, whether you acknowledge it or not. The obligation is prior to the self, not posterior to it. When Mitford translates giri-related situations into English, he inevitably reaches for vocabulary, duty, obligation, debt of honor. That frames the situation in terms of a choosing self deciding to fulfill a recognized obligation, which is precisely the wrong frame. The Japanese figure is not deciding. He is being what he is, and what he is constituted by what he owes. This is a small translation choice, repeated hundreds of times across the text, and its cumulative effect is to domesticate the Japanese ethical world, to make it feel like an expression of values the Victorian reader already holds, just taken to an unusually rigorous extreme, rather than an expression of a fundamentally different ontology of selfhood. The framing problem compounds the mechanical problem. Even when individual concepts are translated with reasonable precision, the literary form that surrounds them shapes how they are received. Victorian prose, the register in which tales of old Japan is written, is a form shaped by specific assumptions about narration, characterization, causality, and moral intelligibility. It assumes an audience that understands the world through individual psychology, that expects stories to move from conflict through development to resolution in ways that illuminate the inner life of the protagonists. Japanese narrative tradition, or at least the tradition represented by the tales Mitford collected, operates on different assumptions. Character is less important than conduct, interiority less important than action, the inner life of the protagonist less important than the integrity of the moral structure within which he operates. When Mitford places Japanese stories inside Victorian prose framing, the stories become legible to the Victorian reader, but they become legible in a way that subtly distorts their logic, making them feel like stories about remarkable individuals rather than demonstrations of a collective ethical system. The selection problem is the deepest and least visible of the three. Mitford chose what to include, and his choices determined what Japan was for the generation of British readers who had no other access to it. He chose the tales of honor and loyalty rather than the tales of ordinary life. He chose the samurai class rather than the farming and merchant classes. He chose the most dramatically intense expressions of Japanese ethical culture, vendetta, seppuku, the supernatural, rather than the daily practices and negotiations that constituted the lived reality of most Japanese people. These choices are entirely understandable. Mitford was producing a book for a market, and the market wanted the exotic and the dramatic. He was also genuinely most interested in the material he selected. His sympathy for the samurai world and its values was real, and genuine sympathy produces more illuminating writing than detached coverage ever could. But the consequence of those understandable choices was a book that presented one class's self-image, the samurai class's idealized account of its own values, as a portrait of Japanese civilization. The gap between the samurai ideal and the everyday reality of Tokugawa Japan was enormous, and it is almost entirely invisible in Mitford's text. The collaboration that produced the book is another invisible layer. Mitford worked with Japanese informants and translators, educated men, almost certainly from samurai or administrative backgrounds, who helped him identify source material, translate texts, and understand context. These collaborators made the book possible, but they are largely absent from it. Their names do not appear prominently. Their choices, about which stories to bring to Mitford's attention, which details to emphasize, which aspects of the samurai tradition to foreground, are woven into the fabric of the text without being marked as their choices. They were not passive conduits. They were active participants in the construction of the Japan that the book presents. And they brought their own interests to that construction. Men from the samurai class, watching that class being dissolved by the Meiji government, had reasons to present the samurai ethical world in the most favorable light possible. The book's portrait of samurai honor may be Mitford's portrait, but it was painted with materials that his collaborators selected. The exotic as a category is not something you discover. It is something you construct, and the construction reflects the desires of the constructor more than the nature of the object. What makes something exotic is not any quality it possesses intrinsically, but the fact that it has been identified, selected, and framed as significant by someone for whom it is foreign. Seppuku is the clearest example in the book. To the samurai class for whom it was an institutional practice, it was not exotic. It was a component of the legal and ethical system within which they operated, with defined procedural requirements and recognized conditions under which it was appropriate. It became exotic when it was extracted from that institutional context, framed as the most extreme expression of a foreign civilization's relationship to death and honor, and presented to a British audience for whom voluntary ritual death was entirely outside the range of normal institutional practice. Mitford did not invent the exoticization of seppuku. It was already well advanced in Western travel writing by the time he arrived in Japan. But his account, because it was witnessed rather than secondhand, because it was precise where earlier accounts were vague, because it was framed by an author with genuine knowledge of the institutional context, became the definitive version. The exotic in his text is always also the real, but the real filtered through the category of the exotic, which means it arrives at the reader already distorted by the frame through which it was selected and presented. The lived reality of Japan in the 1860s was not primarily constituted by vendetta and ritual death and supernatural encounter. It was constituted by the commercial life of the treaty ports, by the anxiety and resentment generated by the unequal treaties, by the political chaos of the final shogunate years, by the violence of the Boshin War, by the rapid and often disorienting pace of institutional change, as the Meiji government dismantled the structures that had organized Japanese life for centuries. Some of this appears in Mitford's text, particularly the political material in his essays, but it appears as context for the cultural material rather than as the primary subject. The Japan of the book is not the Japan of 1866 to 1870, as most Japanese people experienced it. It is a specific cultural stratum of that Japan, the literary and ethical self-representation of a class that was losing its institutional ground and producing art partly as a way of asserting that what it represented had value that institutional dissolution could not erase. The seppuku account is the point at which the exotic and the real are held in the most productive tension. Mitford witnessed an actual execution. His description is precise and honest. He was clearly disturbed. He does not conceal his reaction. He does not perform composure he did not feel. At the same time, the execution itself was already a highly theatrical event. The condemned man was performing a ritual designed to be witnessed, and his composure, his deliberateness, the ceremonial form of his movements, were all directed at the audience in the room as much as they were expressions of internal state. What Mitford witnessed was not raw reality. It was a highly constructed performance of a specific relationship to death, a performance that the condemned man had trained for, that the ritual prescribed in detail, that the institutional context gave its meaning. The realness of the account is real, but the reality it documents is already a kind of art, already a form of cultural production. This is what makes the seppuku account the most honest piece in the book. It is the place where Mitford most clearly cannot separate the documentation from the thing being documented, where the exotic and the real collapse into each other without either term winning. What the selection as a whole tells you about the selector is more legible now than it was in 1871. Mitford was a man formed by a specific class, a specific culture, and a specific historical moment. He was shaped by the Victorian gentleman's admiration for feudal codes, by the British diplomat's interest in political structure and legal institution, by the educated Englishman's nostalgia for a pre-commercial world of honor and obligation that the literature of chivalry had made into an emotional reference point. He brought all of this to Japan. It shaped what he noticed, what he asked his collaborators to explain, what he selected for inclusion, and how he framed what he selected. The result was not a distorted picture of Japan in the sense of being untrue. The specific details are almost always accurate. It was a distorted picture in the more important sense of being incomplete in structured ways that reflect Mitford's own culture's desires rather than Japan's self-understanding. The Japan of Tales of Old Japan is real. It is also a construction. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the text is most interesting precisely at the points where the two truths rub against each other and generate friction. The consequence of that construction extended well beyond Mitford's lifetime. The image of Japan that his book installed in the Western imagination, the samurai as the bearer of a pure honor ethic, Japan as the civilization that had preserved what Europe had lost, seppuku as the ultimate expression of a relationship to dignity and death that modernity had abandoned, became the lens through which Western audiences received subsequent Japanese cultural production. When Lafcadio Hearn wrote his more immersive accounts of Japanese life in the 1890s, he was writing for an audience already shaped by Mitford. When Western audiences encountered Japanese cinema in the 20th century, the films of Kurosawa, with their samurai codes and their Ronin figures and their meditations on loyalty and violence, they brought to those films a set of categories and emotional expectations that had been forming in Western consciousness since 1871. The cultural translation that Mitford performed was not a single event. It was the first move in a long chain of reception, each link of which built on the construction that the previous link had established. Understanding where the chain begins is essential to understanding what the West thinks it knows about Japan, and what it has never been able to see clearly because the frame was built before the looking began. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.